Hi everyone, here we are with chapter 61. Now unfortunately we haven't had another chapter released yet today, and tomorrow is the last day that the Ickabog's being released and it'll be the end of the story. So Monday you'll get the final chapters and then I'd like you to write a book review. But let's have a look at today, Friday's reading, and see what activity you've got. Chapter 61, Flapoon fires again. The two lords dashed out into the palace courtyard to find the Ickabog Defence Brigade already mounted and armed as Spittleworth had ordered. However, Major Prod, the man who'd kidnapped Daisy years before, who'd been promoted after Spittleworth shot Major Broach, was looking nervous. "My lord," he said to Spittleworth, who was hastily mounting his horse, "there's something happening inside the palace. We heard an uproar." "Never mind that now," snapped Spittleworth. A sound of shattering glass made the soldiers look up. "There are people in the king's bedroom," cried Prod. "Shouldn't we help him?" "Forget the king," shouted Spittleworth. Captain Goodfellow now appeared at the king's bedroom window. Looking down, he bellowed, "You won't escape, Spittleworth!" "Oh, won't I?" snarled the lord, and kicking his thin yellow horse, he forced it into a gallop and disappeared out of the palace gates. Major Prod was too scared of Spittleworth not to follow, so he and the rest of the Ickabog Defence Brigade charged after his lordship, along with Flapoon, who'd barely managed to get onto his horse before Spittleworth set off, bouncing along at the rear, holding on to his horse's mane for dear life and trying to find his stirrups. Some men might have considered themselves beaten, what with the escaped prisoners taking over the palace and a fake Ickabog marching through the country and attracting crowds, but not Lord Spittleworth. He still had a squad of well-trained, well-armed soldiers riding behind him, heaps of gold hidden at his mansion in the country, and his crafty brain was already devising a plan. Firstly, he'd shoot the men who'd faked this Ickabog and terrified the people back into obedience. Then he'd send Major Prod and his soldiers back to the palace to kill all the escaped prisoners. Of course, the prisoners might have killed the king by that time, but in truth it might be easier to govern the country without Fred. As he galloped along, Spittleworth thought bitterly that if only he hadn't put so much effort into lying to the king, he might not have made certain mistakes, like letting that wretched pastry chef have knives and saucepans. He also regretted not hiring more spies, because then he might have found out that someone was making a fake Ickabog, a fake by the sound of it that was far more convincing than the one he'd seen that morning in the stables. So the Ickabog Defence Brigade charged through the surprisingly empty cobbled streets of Shoeville and out onto the open road that led to Kurtzburg. To Spittleworth's fury, he now saw why the Shoeville streets had been empty. Having heard the rumour that an actual Ickabog was walking towards the capital with a large crowd, the citizens of Shoeville had hurried out to catch a glimpse of it with their own eyes. "Out of our way! Out of our way!" screamed Spittleworth, scattering the common people before him. Furious to see them looking excited rather than scared, he spurred his horse onwards until its sides were bleeding, and Lord Flapoon followed, now green in the face because he hadn't had time to digest his breakfast. At last Spittleworth and the soldiers spotted the huge crowd advancing in the distance, and Spittleworth hauled at his poor horse's rein so that it skidded to a halt in the road. There, in the midst of the thousands of laughing and singing cornucopians, was a giant creature as tall as two horses, with eyes like glowing like lamps, covered in long greenish-brown hair like marshweed. On its shoulder rode a young woman, and in front of it marched two young men holding up wooden signs. Every now and then the monster stooped down, and yes, it seemed to be handing out flowers. "It's a trick," muttered Spittleworth, so shocked and scared he hardly knew what he was saying. "It must be a trick," he said more loudly, craning his scrawny neck to try and see how it was done. "There are obviously people standing on each other's shoulders inside a suit of marshweed. Guns at the ready, men." But the soldiers were slow to obey. In all the time they'd been supposedly protecting the country from the Ickabog, the soldiers had never seen one, nor had they really expected to. Yet they weren't at all convinced they were watching a trick. On the contrary, the creature looked very real to them. It was patting dogs on the head and handing out flowers to children and letting that little girl sit on its shoulder. It didn't seem fierce at all. The soldiers were also scared of the crowd of thousands marching along with the Ickabog, who all seemed to like it. What would they do if the Ickabog was attacked? Then one of the youngest soldiers lost his head completely. "That's not a trick. I'm off." But anybody could stop him, he galloped away. Flapoon, who'd at last found his stirrups, now rode up front to take his place beside Spittleworth. "What do we do?" asked Flipoon, watching the Ickabog and the joyful singing crowd drawing nearer and nearer. "I'm thinking," snarled Spittleworth. "I'm thinking." But the cogs of Spittleworth's busy brain seemed to have jammed at last. It was the joyful faces that upset him most. He'd come to think of laughter as a luxury, like Chouville pastry and silk sheets, and seeing these ragged people having fun frightened him more than if they'd all been carrying guns. "I'll shoot it," said Flipoon, raising his gun and taking aim at the Ickabog. "No," said Spittleworth. "Look, man, can't you see we're outnumbered?" But at that precise moment the Ickabog let out a deafening, blood-curdling scream. The crowd that had pressed around it backed away, and their faces suddenly scared. Many dropped their flowers, some broke into a run. When another terrible screech, the Ickabog fell to its knees, almost shaking Daisy loose, though she clung on tightly. And then a huge dark split appeared down the Ickabog's enormous swollen belly. "You were right, Spittleworth," bellowed Flipoon, raising his blunderbuss. "There are men hiding inside it." And as people in the crowd began to scream and flee, Lord Flipoon took aim at the Ickabog's belly and fired. Oh no, well I wonder what they'll have created if the Ickabog's bonding is now upsetting, is shot at and everyone's afraid. That won't create happy little Ickabogs, or Ickaboggles as it's called. So head over to Purple Mash. You'll have an activity for today, and then hopefully we'll have our new chapter up tomorrow, so that we can finish the Ickabog and see what happens.